Uh, so before I get started this week, I am coming down with a cold, so if I cough, I apologize. My voice may sound a bit raspy, that's why. So today's topic is gem style. Everyone has a different one, and I feel that this is something I probably should have done to begin with, but I needed to do a little bit of prep up to this point. So I kind of had to push this along to now, basically. Uh, but obviously there is a formula, there is structure to this to stop me just rambling for however long the stream goes. So I'll get started with the structure. So recap, it's very simple. There isn't one. A lot of stuff came up last week that meant that my group couldn't assemble to play, so we didn't get to play at all, which is annoying, but life happens, and it's something that no one can do anything about. You can't predict it. So when it happens, it happens. You just have to accept it. Um, Fortunately for my group, when something like this does happen, it all happens at the same time. So kind of we all play, occasionally minus one person, or we none of us play at all. So it's weird, but it's it's good that it works out that way. So GMing style in general, um, if you've watched any of these videos, tuned into any of my streams, whatever up to this point, you'll notice that a lot of the time I keep going back to the point of make everything simple. Um, and that's kind of the core philosophy of how I GM a tabletop role playing game, both virtual tabletop, which I do have more leeway in preparation for, but also just actual tabletop. Um, but I'll discuss a few others before getting to my DMing style, which will be in the putting into practice section. So you've got, the way I see it anyway, there are kind of three main styles of GMing: being prepared, so preparing material in advance; on the fly, which is very difficult, but it is what it sounds like. You don't prepare anything in advance. You improv everything, um, and kind of accept that sometimes you'll make mistakes, but hope that most of the time you won't. And then the middle ground is that's what it sounds like. It's you take a bit from both preparing a lot of material in advance and from improvising everything on the spot. Um, so that's kind of the brief summary of each of the styles as I see them. And if you have any comments to make, obviously Twitch chat, because I stream this on Twitch, or if you're watching this live, or the YouTube comments section is also a good way to provide feedback. So the prepared style, as I say, it's what it sounds like, is just prepare material in advance. Usually this is more people who like to prepare all of the material that they need, or the vast majority of it. So there's kind of a less of a reliance on improv skills or kind of like random encounter tables, that kind of thing. And this works for a lot of people, and there's no reason why it wouldn't work, because it means you've got all the information to hand uh, when you need it, which obviously is great. The downside of having all the information to hand when you need it is that, and I found this because this was how I started GMing, this was my style initially, was that sometimes you just have too much information. And say you put a lot of thought and effort into the world that you're building, and you want to be true to what you've written about the world, which means that whenever something comes up that you can't remember at the table, you have to kind of pause the game, flick hurriedly through your notes to try and find roughly where you think it is, read the note or read the information that you've written, prepared, and then resume play with that information. And that's great. Having that kind of consistency, to the world is incredible for immersion, and having that kind of all-encompassing factor to the world where everything is already laid out and the players are just kind of inhabiting it. As I said, it's great for immersion, but if you're having to stop the flow of the game to check the information, obviously that's breaking immersion and can be a real problem. Case in point, when I started this campaign, I wrote an entire history of the city for the just over a millennia that kind of people have been living in that area up to the construction of the city, then natural disasters, wars, riots, that kind of thing. Just because I thought it would be useful to have, but it really wasn't. It's never come up. I've never needed to know the history of the city in that much detail. And I did this with the country that it's set in as a whole, and again, it's never come up. So while it's good for confidence to have this information to hand, it's not always the most efficient usage of your time. And as I say, sometimes it can break immersion at the table, which I guess is kind of a valid point that needs emphasizing. And there are certainly, for this style of GMing, there are certainly gems out there, the quote unquote celebrity GMs that benefit from this style. I believe Matmus is one of them. I believe he prepares a lot of material in advance. And this is something that's great if you aren't comfortable with improv or just aren't comfortable with GMing in general. Having that kind of barrier, that cushion of prepared material can be a great confidence booster because you know there's something there if it goes wrong, there's something you can fall back onto. So there are definitely merits to this style, but there are also drawbacks to it, as there are to any GMing style. And I don't believe that this entire discussion is going to take terribly long, depending on how long putting into practice takes. But as I say, I think it's important to understand kind of my approach in the context or my videos in the context of my approach. So we'll go to on the fly. Probably won't spend too much time on this. It's just improvise everything. And this is the other end of entirely the other end of the spectrum. Obviously, this is where you don't prepare anything in advance. You rely solely on your memory of what's happened already and on just an understanding of the characters, an understanding of storytelling and narrative design in general, an understanding of not necessarily what story you want to help the players tell in its entirety, but what story you want to help the players tell at that moment in time. And that is a lot of pressure to put on yourself, and it is very much kind of flying by the seat of your pants, if you'll pardon the expression. But it's it's one of those things where when it's done right, the players have no idea that you haven't got anything prepared, and frequently I don't have anything prepared for a session. The stuff I've been doing recently, as I've explained, it's because it's stuff that I don't feel I can improvise well enough to have a satisfying conclusion. Hence the preparation I've been doing. But I felt that it might help other people to see my preparation and help them kind of be inspired. So obviously, if you are improvising at everything, then it has the downside of there is no safety net. If you can't think of something, if you struggle to draw upon the next narrative thread or the next fantastical location, then your game is going to well, it's going to not suffer isn't the right word, but the flow of the game is going to be interrupted and immersion is going to suffer. Immersion is going to suffer, sorry, and this is probably one of those instances. It'll almost definitely be one of those instances where you kind of have to admit to your players that you're struggling for ideas, and well, not even have to admit, but just call a 5 minute break for refreshments or something, so you can take that time to process what's just happened and address your thoughts and feelings on the subject and plan from there. Fortunately, I've never had to do that, and I don't think I've ever put a GM in a position where they've had to do that. But if I ever did do that to a GM, I would 100% understand them having to do that. 100% understand them having to call that break. And on a kind of an extension of the not having a safety net, obviously, sometimes kind of in-world consistency can suffer for it. What I mean by this is that because you are improvising everything, sometimes you might forget to write something down. I do this all the time. I forget to write NPCs down, or an aspect of the scene that should be obvious just slips my mind entirely because I haven't prepared the scene in advance. And sure, a lot of the time, players won't necessarily pick up on this because they're more invested in the story or they're more invested in what their character's doing at that moment in time. But I feel like I'm letting myself down by not having a consistent experience. And this is, of course, the hindsight is 2020 thing, where after the fact I can find the weaknesses in a lot of the material I put out for my players, and I'm constantly doubting and second guessing their experiences. But something to bear in mind if you do try this GMing style is that very thing. Be prepared to accept that you're going to make mistakes because you inevitably will, unless you're incredibly experienced or you kind of intuitively understand things like this. Mistakes are going to happen. Players may or may not pick up on them. You definitely will, but you just have to accept that's going to happen and move on. On the flip side, though, and I might just drop this back up here, so it's because it's more of a positive. The game and the story that you're telling remains fluid because you aren't. How best to phrase this? Because you aren't stuck on one path through the story. You aren't following a script. I guess would be a better way of putting it. The players can go off script a lot easier. And sure, you can repurpose rooms and kind of locations that you've prepared in advance with very little effort. And I do that sometimes with kind of pre-prepared material where I'm reading through something and think, oh, that's cool, I'll just take that. But because they can go off script at the drop of a hat, if you're comfortable with this GMing style, you can the game can go in wildly different directions from even your experience. As an example, people who've watched these videos, caught my streams, what have you, will hopefully remember a few months ago at this point, Party Warlock aggroed an entire group of guards where I expected them all to sneak into the compound. And because I was comfortable enough with the situation to say, okay, this is what's going to happen, the player was able to do that. He didn't feel forced into sneaking around with everyone else. He just felt able to step into the middle of the road and start casting spells. And the unpredictable nature of player actions versus what I've got in my head could happen is great, because as the GM, obviously you're in charge of the main story beats that are going to happen. If you follow the type of campaign writing I spoke about recently, but the bits in between, the bits where you get from A to B, are left entirely up to the players, and it stops the game getting stale and boring for you as the GM by having that chaotic, random element. Because it would be so easy to dictate to the players where they go and what they do and how they do it, but letting them do what they want, letting the game and the story be fluid and in constant flux until it actually happens. It's a great way of making sure that you remain interested in the game and invested, certainly. And as a result, kind of lowers the chance of burnout. I've suffered from burnout before, in terms of kind of creative burnout when role playing, because I just felt that the story that I wanted to tell wasn't being told, and that the players were ignoring kind of what I thought were fairly obvious plot hooks. But then I realized that the problem wasn't my players were ignoring the plot hooks and they weren't following the story I wanted to tell. It was that I was holding too tightly to the story, that I wasn't comfortable letting go of it and letting the situation become fluid again. And I think that once I made this realization, I stopped holding on to the idea that the players will do X thing to level up, because I use narrative milestones, and allowed them to tell their own story and dictate their own narrative beats and insert other stuff for them to do into the current level. The game got immeasurably better, at least from my perspective, and kind of the burnout resolved itself. So then we get into the middle ground, which, if you hadn't guessed by now, is how I GM. As it suggests, it takes aspects of both. So it is in large part improv. I prefer not to spend too much time preparing material, because I don't. If I've prepared the material, then I'll feel hidebound to follow it, and I don't want to be breaking immersion by saying something and then remembering that what I've prepared is something else and then having to correct myself, or kind of feeling off balance or wrong-footed because we're not experiencing what I was expecting to experience at that point. But at the same time, there is a safety barrier of a safety net of prepared material, which I'll put in air quotes because it's prepared in that I've got well, as we saw last week, I've got the traps that I've designed for this upcoming dungeon crawl, or to be inserted into any dungeon if the players ignore the dungeon crawl. But that's probably as far ahead as I'm going to prepare for the dungeon. I'm not necessarily going to do a floor plan for it. I've got some Pathfinder dry wipe dungeon tiles I might lay down as a random kind of network of rooms. There are plenty of random generators online. I might use one of those to give some structure to the dungeon. But mostly when I do that, it's just a case of picking a room in that randomly generated dungeon that seems cool or seems kind of like in a good location to have a trap in it. And then I'll put the trap that I've prepared in that room, and that way the players are free to explore this complex, this dungeon. But it takes a lot of weight off of me from having to plan out the dungeon. And sure, with small dungeons where it's only going to be like a few rooms, I'm more than happy improvising that. And the for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the Dungeon Master's Guide has a whole section about randomly generating dungeons that you can use as inspiration. Kind of just flick through the book, spot a thing that might be cool to have in the room that the players are in or approaching, and then do that. But for larger dungeons, and I haven't really run any of these yet for the players because of the nature of the campaign so far, I very much prefer having I'll do some prep as I did last week and the week before with the traps, and then I'll almost definitely use a random dungeon generator, not necessarily for the floor plan, but the one I tend to use I think is Don John's. I'll just add that so people can search it. I believe that's the one I use. I won't necessarily use that for the floor plan, although I probably will because I am lazy. But it generates stuff in the rooms as well. It generates wandering monsters and it generates monster encounters and things like that, which I ignore. But it does generate kind of points of interest in the room, and if it seems cool or in the context of that part of the dungeon seems likely, I'll include that in the description of the room. And if it doesn't, I won't. But I did this early on, kind of a medium-sized dungeon. There was more rooms than I was comfortable improving, and the whole idea of the dungeon was that it was this chaotic place. So I just randomly generated a floor plan and then mashed a lot of kind of horror tropes together to fit in it. But one of the kind of room prompts was so cool. I can't remember what it was now, unfortunately, but it's so cool that I turned it into a puzzle in that room for the players to solve. And that's what I mean. Kind of that's the purest example I can think of the middle ground of taking something that requires a minimal preparation, a random dungeon generator, and then improvising off of that. So you've got the basis for what's happening already, and that lends that gives the scene, the encounter, what have you, a framework for consistency. Sorry, frog in my throat. A framework for consistency, and then you just improvise on top of that. Another benefit, obviously, because it is heavily improv, is that the game again remains fluid. because there is the safety net, and because there is the prepared material, again, liberal air quotes, below it, uh, it helps you feel more comfortable in improvising on top of it, much like with the dungeon scenario. So you aren't constantly checking through notes. You aren't constantly beholden to the idea of the players will go here, they'll go here, they'll go here, they'll do this, 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 and this. You're more open to the players going elsewhere and doing something completely different because you know you have a vague idea of what's happening, but not how it's happening or what exactly is happening. And that, certainly to me, and that's why I favour this approach, is helps with player investment because hopefully it makes them feel that they are actors in this world, they have agency. They're not just following the path I want them to follow. And kind of this applies to not just guided gameplay, going back to like previous week's stream, but to all forms of gameplay. Even if you do the style that I favour with vague story beats, it can still feel like the players are following a path that you're leading them along. So having the flexibility of sorry, I stutter occasionally. Improvising the encounters or the scenarios or the locations these things are happening in helps the player agency. And obviously player agencies, but it's really important to me. Players should be as invested in the game as you are. Without that, the game will probably fall apart, or some people will enjoy the game, some people won't, and you'll be able to kind of the mood at the table. You'll be able to read the mood at the table. However, because it is the middle ground, because you don't have everything prepared, you get the same problem that you can be wrong-footed. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I certainly enjoy it when I'm wrong-footed because I feel it is a challenge to my challenges my skills as a GM. But because the players can do stuff that comes out of nowhere, because you don't have this rigid framework for them to follow, and you don't have stacks and stacks of notes prepared for that session, the players can do something that makes you think, huh, what happens now? However, unlike on the fly, because you do have the quote unquote safety net of, again, liberal air quotes, prepared material, you should be comfortable enough with the situation to invent something on the fly, or kind of not need to call a break, but think for a moment or two and then progress from there. So you might have a small break in the flow of the game, but it shouldn't be too large, if that makes sense. But it's definitely something to be aware of if you do follow this middle ground path to GMing. Because if you aren't prepared for it and it does happen, luckily it hasn't happened to me yet, but if I weren't prepared for it, I imagine that kind of player immersion would suffer greatly because I'd be floundering like I am right now because I don't script these, I just have this structure I follow. Mostly because I don't have a great reading voice. So also you may have realized by now I don't prepare much in advance because that's just not who I am. And the middle ground, obviously, you'll have picked up by now, um, it has the advantages and disadvantages of both, being of both the prepared style and the on-the-fly style. I think that's really the final point to say here. And if you do start adopting this approach, and by all means, I find it the more liberating, I guess, in a way, because I'm not constrained to a set goal, but I also have a rough idea of what's happening, so I can build upon that rough idea. And it allows me to ask questions of myself that the other two might not necessarily allow me to ask. But if you find yourself preferring the advantages of one style over another style, by all means just go for that style and take what you want from the other style. But as with everything, kind of GM style and narrative design and the writing of the campaign itself, as I've said before, until you say it, it's in flux. So be flexible with your GMing style. Don't be married to a certain style. Certainly when something calls for structure, like a dungeon crawl, or a defining moment for a character, for example, prepare that in advance so that when it arrives, you know exactly what's happening, so you can give it the appropriate gravitas that it needs. Sorry about that. One of these days I'll close that window. Essentially, yeah, that's really it. Just bearing in mind that this style does have drawbacks. It has the drawbacks of the other two styles, and it has the advantages of the other two styles, as I've said. Just think about ways of dealing with them, I guess is the best way to put it. As I said, if you prefer the advantages of one style over the other, or you you kind of fear the disadvantages of a style over the others, change your style. If you aren't enjoying how you're running the game will probably suffer for it. I think that's that. So putting into practice, because these are theory and practice lessons, kind of, I've touched on this several times, but it'll be kind of how I approach GMing. And as I say, kind of have that prepared framework. That's not hyphenated, you idiot. Which in a lot of cases does require front loading the preparation. So what this means is as you can see on these videos, I started in video 1 with defining the key aspects of this area of the Shadowfell, for example, and that's driven everything from that kind of session onwards. Everything's been calling back to those aspects, and I've been calling back to the NPCs that I created on stream. And really, with those two things, with nearby locations of interest and kind of the driving aspects of those locations, and with the NPCs in the area, I could have run this whole level without preparing anything else, because those are the two things I feel are key to narrative consistency. And as I believe I've said before, NPCs are your player's gateway to the world. They're how they learn about the world in ways that they can't directly experience. My players, I don't expect to read any of the material I provide them. Sure, I provide them with kind of a town guide to scour. I don't expect them to read it because they can learn everything they need to learn from the NPCs they encounter in scour. If they do read it, cool. Especially with characters that live and were born in scour, but they don't have to because I can tell them at the table through NPCs as appropriate or just kind of out of character because you're born here, you would know X. Um, but having that framework of locations and NPCs, sure, it can take an hour or two. If you devote more to that, you're probably creating too much. Um, it gives you the world in which to play until you need to create again, such as for major scene changes or major location changes where the NPCs aren't going to be the same, or kind of when story beats prompt NPCs changing. And then for certain situations, much like this dungeon crawl that the players are going to have the option to do, having the traps prepared in advance is for me a peace of mind thing more than anything else. It's not necessary. I can improv traps, I've done it before. I can improv puzzles, I've done it before. But I like that extra um, kind of week or so to mull things over, to hone the idea of the trap or the puzzle, to really kind of hammer home what that should be like and how it fits into the overall dungeon. So I suppose what I do on addition to having this front-loaded preparation is prepare what makes you comfortable. And obviously, if you're preparing a lot because that's what makes you more comfortable, you're leaning towards being the prepared style rather than the middle ground. Um, and that's all well and good. I class myself as a middle ground in this place, in this instance, because yes, I prepared the encounters in advance. Yes, I've prepared the traps and puzzles in advance, but primarily that was to demonstrate my philosophies on stream and the YouTube recordings as kind of practical examples of GN tips, because all too often you get people saying you should do this for this reason and then moving on, whereas I always found it more beneficial to me, certainly, for someone to say you should do this for this reason and this is how it looks in practice. um, so while I don't usually do as much preparation as I've done recently, because I have a good enough understanding of, in this case, Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition rule set to create encounters on the fly and to run um, combat with multiple actors in it. And in a lot of cases, I improvise the stat blocks for the creatures that my players are encountering, and a lot of the time it goes well, and it's usually balanced pretty well for the party. But also, um, don't be afraid to leave questions hanging. Don't. Sure, by all means, prepare what makes you comfortable, but sometimes don't push yourself to create stuff on the spot, to add that element of chance and fluidity into the game. This is, admittedly, this is why I prepare traps when I can or when I feel I should, because I'm always worried that my players will find what I think kind of on the spot at the table to be predictable. Um, sorry again, Halloween spooky. Uh, so I took the advantage of that GM session, tip session, to think of something I've never done at the table before. and to actually sit down and devote time to it, which kind of leads me to my next point of make good use of your time. This is especially important, I feel, because not everyone has the amount of time other people have, obviously. I have the benefit of working from home. It's only a part-time job, so I have a lot of spare time. So if I wanted to, I could prepare everything. But I choose not to because I have other hobbies, other things I want to do. I do things like this. I stream to try and build a community where people can feel welcomed and included. Because I am disabled. I do have social problems, and I want to create this place where people like me can feel like they belong. And I don't want to spend all my time consulting stat blocks and with pencil to graph paper sketching out dungeons. And don't get me wrong, that is incredibly fun. But I want to do other things. And for someone who has a full-time job on top of running a role-playing game, their time's even less. So the middle ground is an easier way to make good use of your time because you quickly, if you pay attention to your players and to your tabletop experience in general, you'll learn what bits you're good at improvising and what bits you aren't good at improvising, and what, more importantly, what bits your players enjoy. And I'm not saying kind of bow to your players' wishes all the time, because we are, as a GM, here to make the game interesting and not too easy for them. Not that we should be able to, destroy them, but we should be there to challenge them when it's appropriate to challenge them. So by figuring out what you prefer improvising and what you prefer preparing in advance means you can use your time more effectively to actually prepare that material. So, for instance, I watched a kind of a GM tip video about why you shouldn't create homebrew creatures. And I watched it and I thought, yeah, that's good advice, because there are so many creatures in official supplements alone that you shouldn't need to homebrew. But if it's something you enjoy doing, do it. It's something I enjoy doing, certainly, and I can't imagine I'm alone in that. Or for like with the traps, the guidelines given by wizards are really vague, but they're good enough that you could just reskin the examples they give you, or kind of figure out reverse engineering from traps in published adventures, right? But if you like making your own traps, if you like reading fiction and there's a puzzle in a book that you like that the protagonist goes through, figure out how that would work in D&D. This is exactly what I did last week with the bell puzzle that my players may or may not encounter. But because I've figured out what I'm happy improvising, NPCs, locations, that kind of thing, I can more efficiently use my time to prepare the stuff that I can improvise, and I'm happy improvising, but I prefer creating in advance. So traps, for example. Which kind of, I've mentioned this as part of this previous point, but take inspiration where you can. Sometimes literally. So literally take that inspiration whole hog and just put it in your game if it suits it. A good example of this is if you don't read the official kind of guidelines, the Boulder Trap. I mean, this is a pop culture trope. You've got it in Indiana Jones, for example. Just a boulder, top of a hill, rolling down. But if you've never never encountered that idea before, and you've never read the guidelines provided, and you see this happen, this guy running from a boulder downhill, and you're like, man, that's really cool. I want that in my game. Put it in your game. Change what you want to change. If you don't want to change anything, don't. That's fine. Um, improve it if you want to. Don't improve it if you feel that wouldn't benefit your game. Don't be afraid to just take the ideas of others. And if anyone calls you on it, admit that it's not an original idea, but as long as it makes for a fun experience at the table, everyone should be fine with it. And kind of this leads me on to my final point, I guess. Certainly for the middle ground, where I don't want to be preparing everything in advance myself. Let other people do the legwork. And this can just be sometimes, as I say, taking puzzles and traps whole hog from other sources, or reskinning existing trap examples. But it's also taking ideas from elsewhere. I'm an avid reader, so if I come across a scene or a character in a book that I think will be cool at the tabletop, I'll take them. I'll probably rename them and alter them slightly so it's not an obvious copy, so it's not a carbon copy, but it will be functionally the same person. Example of this, the campaign that I play in, my player character started out as basic character inspiration was quote from Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicles. She's grown from there, but that is where she started, and that was kind of my guiding light for the first 3 sessions of play was Quote's behavior, how Quote would react to situations. And then if you're lucky enough to own or know people who do own published modules, read them. They are a great source of traps, encounters, magic items, monsters you don't find anywhere else. And just take them and make them into something that would fit in your game. And I realize this is kind of flying in the face of what I said about not creating monsters, because there are so many monsters out there. But if it's fun for you to do, or you can't immediately bring to mind an existing example of something, by all means, make your own encounters. I generally do. I've got published modules. I don't tend to use the encounters in them because I just like the feel of putting something together myself and realizing afterwards that the encounter, it did what I wanted it to do. It was a challenge to the players, or it was easy for the players, and if that was the intent, that's great. If it wasn't the intent, that's a learning that's a lesson learned. But don't be afraid to just find encounters, traps, puzzles, monsters, what have you, that other people have made, and use those. A lot of the time you won't be able to. A lot of the time with encounters and things, you won't be able to use them as is. You will have to do some tinkering, but that's the joy of the game. Certainly, that's kind of one of my main interests. What draws me to the game is that I can just alter things on the fly. I can find something that works in one circumstance and make it work in another circumstance, sometimes just by changing damage type or kind of inverting something about the situation. I think that's really everything I wanted to cover. So the great thing about the summary section is obviously I've got now I've started typing up my points, so that you don't have to listen to my voice if you don't want to. I don't have to type anything in the summary section, but it's there because if you want to skip to the end of the video and just listen to that, that's fine. More power to you. So I guess in summary, three main kinds of GMing style. Prepared, where you prepare most, if not all, of the material in advance. It doesn't require as much on improvisation and random encounters because you have all the information to hand when you need it, but sometimes you may have too much information to go through to find what you need at a crucial moment, so immersion breaks and the game suffers for it. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got on the fly, where very little is prepared, most material is improvised. It helps the game to remain fluid, but it means that there is no safety net. There's nothing to fall back on if you can't think of anything. And it's easy to forget small details that may alter game consistency for yourself or the players. And then there's the middle ground, which is what I favor, where you have a framework of prepared material. For me, it's usually locations and NPCs, and then kind of just riff off of that as and when needed. If you feel like you need more prepared material because you can be caught wrong-footed, there are plenty of random generators out there for kind of every need you might possibly have. Or don't be afraid to take a few moments to think about what could happen next, or something that the players would pick up on, or players may have missed, or player characters may have missed. And then putting it to practice, it's really all about just at the end of the day, understand your limitations and comfort zone, and prepare accordingly. If you're happy improvising everything, you don't have the time to prepare, just improvise everything. That is perfectly fine and valid. I do a lot of improv at the table because that's what makes me happy. I like the challenge of creating stuff on the fly and hoping the players don't notice. But I'm comfortable doing that because I do the location and NPC preparation, and because I've internalized the rule set, which does technically fall under preparation. But also just make good use of your time. Don't do stuff you don't enjoy that the players don't enjoy. Use your time in a manner that benefits the game, and if that does mean just taking examples and reskinning them from elsewhere, do that. I highly doubt anyone's going to mind. And on that note, I reckon that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. So again, this was streamed live at twitch.tv/comradebubbles, and it's going to go up on YouTube at youtube.com, with the channel being Comrade Bubbles. I haven't yet figured out when I want to regularly upload the videos. For instance, I don't think I haven't put up last week's yet, so I'll check that out and do that either today or tomorrow. I'm running low on time now. But if you ever want to contact me, feel free to engage in the Twitch chat. Follow the channel so you get an email when I go live. Or you could, of course, use the YouTube comments. I'm not going to ask for a like or subscribe. That's entirely up to you. It gets really annoying when people do it all the time. Yes, it helps the channel grow, but at the end of the day, do what you want to do. I only really promote the Twitch follows because that is an email update when I go live, and some people might enjoy knowing when I'm live. But until next time, have a good week and roll well.